Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The twilight crept across the polished oak of Malfoy Manor, painting the grand hall in hues of bruised purple and faded gray. Silence, thick and heavy, draped itself over everything, a far more oppressive weight than any cursed Draco had ever known. It had been nearly 6 months since Astoria's funeral, and with each passing day, the silence had only deepened, suffocating the last vestiges of warmth from the ancient stones. Draco moved like a ghost within his own home. He had long ago retreated from the sprawling, elegant wings of the manor, abandoning the gilded drawing rooms and the formal dining hall where laughter once echoed, albeit rarely. He had sealed himself off, not just from the outside world, from the ministry missives and the tentative invitations from former schoolmates, but from his own son, Scorpius. The boy, bright and earnest, had tried at first. Little notes left on his desk, quiet footsteps outside his study door. But Draco had offered only a closed door, a distant nod, a choked-back goodnight, that felt more like a farewell. The grief was a thick, impenetrable fog, and he couldn't bear to let anyone, especially Scorpius, witness him lost within it. The very air of the manor, once filled with the hushed whispers of house elves and the rustle of Narcissus silks, now felt empty. It was too large, too grand for one haunted man. He craved the anonymity of smaller, forgotten spaces. And so, with a grim determination, he had moved into the oldest, most neglected part of the estate, the rarely used West Wing, a rambling collection of dusty rooms that had not seen a resident for generations. Here, cobwebs hung like forgotten tapestries, and the air was perpetually cool, even in summer. His chosen retreat was a small, high-ceilinged room at the very end of a winding corridor, far from the central staircase and the faint sounds of Scorpius and the house elves. It was a room that had likely served as a dusty archive or a forgotten study. On his first night, as he lit a solitary, non-magical lamp, its weak glow cut through the gloom, revealing stacks of neglected scrolls and forgotten artifacts. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just the quiet isolation that these neglected spaces offered. His fingers, still slender and elegant despite years of practical wizardry, brushed against a small, ornate silver candlestick tucked away on a dusty, cluttered shelf. It wasn't particularly grand, not like the opulent heirlooms in the main part of the manor, but it held a peculiar simplicity. Nestled within its intricately carved holder was a single, untouched white candle, slender and perfectly formed, its wick pristine. There was something about its stillness, its untouched nature, that drew him. As he picked up the candlestick, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer caught his eye. Around the base of the silver holder, etched in a delicate, almost flowing script, was an inscription. The words were ancient, curling elegantly, hinting at magic that felt different from anything he had ever known. He ran a thumb over the cool metal, tracing the unfamiliar letters. Quid allitividir voles retrorsum specta. He muttered the Latin words aloud, his voice rough from disuse. That which you wish to see differently, look backward. A strange phrase. A puzzle. He turned the candlestick over in his hand. It wasn't a warning, not a curse. It felt like an invitation. An invitation to what, he couldn't say. But in his desperate search for anything that might break the suffocating silence, anything that felt new and unknown, this ancient, inscribed candlestick, with its single, perfect candle, felt like a silent, intriguing promise. He placed it carefully on the small, unadorned table by his worn armchair, the inscription facing him. He didn't know it then, but this simple discovery was about to change the very nature of his solitude. The night outside the West Wing was a tapestry of deeper shadows and the faint whisper of wind through ancient trees. Inside, the silence of Draco's self-imposed exile pressed in on him, heavier than usual. He had spent the evening poring over old, forgotten ledgers, trying to lose himself in the mundane details of estate management, anything to quiet the ceaseless ache in his chest. As the hours stretched, a chill seeped into the room, and his single lamp offered little warmth. His eyes fell upon the silver candlestick he'd found earlier, sitting on the small table. The pristine white candle seemed to glow faintly even unlit, a tiny beacon in the gloom. Without conscious thought, driven only by a vague desire for more light, more something to fill the emptiness. Draco reached for his wand. A silent incendio flickered at the tip, and then, with a soft pop, the wick caught. But this was no ordinary flame. The light that bloomed from the candle was not the harsh, yellow glow of his lamp, nor the flickering orange of a common fire. It was a pure, golden luminescence, soft and warm, that filled the small room, chasing away the shadows in a way no normal light ever could. The air, which had been cold and still, suddenly softened, growing strangely pliant, almost viscous. The very edges of the room seemed to blur, the solid walls taking on a dreamlike quality, as if the space itself was exhaling. Dust motes, once dancing, now hung suspended, twinkling like distant stars. Draco felt a strange lightness, a sensation of falling backwards, though he remained seated. The hum in his ears intensified, a gentle, melodic thrumming that resonated deep within his bones. The scent of beeswax and old paper faded, replaced by something sweeter, like spring blossoms after a rain, mixed with the faint, comforting scent of Astoria's favorite tea. Then, the room around him began to shift. The worn armchair, the dusty table, the shelves of books, they all dissolved, melting away like mist. In their place, a scene formed around him, shimmering into focus with an impossible clarity. He was no longer in his dark, isolated room. He was in the sunlit study of the main manor, the very room he had shared with Astoria. The windows were bright, the curtains billowing gently in a phantom breeze. And there, at the large mahogany desk, sat Astoria. She looked just as she had then, vibrant despite the faint shadows beneath her eyes, her dark hair catching the light. She held a crisp white envelope, her fingers tracing the words on it with a peculiar slowness. Draco knew this moment. He remembered it with a sharp, painful clarity. It was the day the healer's letter arrived, confirming her diagnosis. The diagnosis that had stolen their future. He saw himself in the memory, standing by the fireplace, absorbed in a copy of the Daily Prophet, dismissive, too busy, too absorbed in his own carefully constructed apathy to truly look at her. His past self hadn't seen the tremor in her hand, hadn't noticed the subtle tightening of her lips, the way her shoulders seemed to slump. But now he saw everything. He saw the way her eyes, usually bright with a quiet resilience, were filled with a raw, unspoken fear as she reread the words. He saw her lips part as if to call his name, then pressed together in a thin line, as if she was bracing herself. He saw a tear, slow and silent, track a path down her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. She folded the letter with meticulous care, placed it back in the envelope, and then, with a deep, shaky breath, she simply placed it on the desk, out of sight, and turned back to her book, pretending to read. Draco watched, transfixed, a silent observer in this spectral replay. He tried to speak, tried to move, to reach out, to go to his past self and shake him, tell him to look, to listen, to comfort her. But he was a phantom. His hand passed through the shimmering air where the desk stood. His voice, when he tried to call out, was a soundless whisper. He was trapped in a moment he had lived, yet failed to truly see. He was there, but he couldn't change a single thing. He could only observe, witness the quiet terror she had faced alone, while he stood meters away, oblivious. The golden light flickered. The spring blossom scent began to fade. The familiar hum intensified, then slowly receded. The walls of his study solidified around him, the golden glow dimming, pulling him back. The single lamp on his table was once again the sole source of light, its yellow beam harsh and unforgiving. He was back in the empty wing. The candle, still burning with its unusual flame, was noticeably shorter, a stark white column now scarred by a single, dark ring where the wax had mysteriously receded, not burned down. He stared at it, his heart a raw, gaping wound. The memory, so vivid, so painful, had left him utterly devastated. He had seen her fear, her silent suffering, and he had been powerless to change it, just as he had been powerless to stop her death. But this time, he couldn't escape the vision. It was seared into his mind, a silent accusation. The candle had shown him not what he wanted to see, but what he needed to see. The memory of Astoria's quiet fear, witnessed through the candle's strange glow, haunted Draco. It was a wound reopened, a silent accusation that lingered long after the golden light had faded. Yet, amidst the devastation, a strange, undeniable pull tugged at him. The candle, despite its painful revelations, offered a glimpse into moments he had missed, a chance to truly see what he had merely glanced at. It was a horrifying, yet strangely compelling, opportunity for understanding. So when dusk painted the west wing in its familiar shades of gray, Draco found himself reaching for the silver candlestick once more. His hand trembled slightly, a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. He lit the wick with a silent incendio, and again the room softened, the air grew pliant, and the golden luminescence bloomed, pushing back the shadows of his self-imposed solitude. The familiar, gentle hum filled his ears, a prelude to the journey backward. The walls dissolved, the present fading into the vibrant, impossible clarity of the past. This time, he wasn't in the manor. He was in the bustling corridors of Hogwarts, the sounds of distant laughter and hurried footsteps echoing around him. He saw himself, younger, sharper, leaning against a stone wall, surrounded by Crabbe and Goyle, a sneer plastered on his face. And then he saw Blaise Zabini approaching. Blaise, even then, carried himself with a quiet confidence, an effortless elegance that Draco had always grudgingly admired. In the memory, Blaise paused, his dark eyes assessing Draco. "Heard you had a rough Quidditch practice, Malfoy," Blaise said, his voice even, devoid of the usual sycophancy. "Potter's seeker skills improving, then?" Draco's past self scoffed, turning away. "What's it to you, Zabini? Mind your own business." He remembered dismissing Blaise's attempt at camaraderie, mistaking it for gloating, or perhaps, simply finding it irrelevant. He had been so consumed by his own petty rivalries and imagined slights that he had shut out anyone who wasn't actively validating his narrow worldview. But now, as a silent observer, Draco saw the subtle shift in Blaise's expression, a flicker of genuine concern, quickly replaced by a resigned shrug. Blaise hadn't been mocking him, he had been attempting to connect, to offer a moment of shared experience. Draco, in his arrogance and self-absorption, had completely missed it. He had chosen isolation, even when an opening was offered. The golden light intensified, pulling him deeper. The Hogwarts corridor shimmered, then melted away, replaced by the austere, echoing confines of a Malfoy Manor drawing room. This was a different time, much earlier, during his childhood. He saw a younger version of himself, perhaps 10 years old, sitting stiffly on a velvet chair, listening. And there, looming over him, was Lucius Malfoy, his father, his face stern and unyielding. Lucius was lecturing him, as he often did, on the importance of family legacy, of duty, of the purity of their bloodline. Draco remembered this specific lecture, the endless litany of rules and expectations. He remembered feeling a dull resentment, a stifling pressure. "Remember this, Draco," Lucius's voice echoed, cold and precise, each word a hammer blow. "The true strength of our name, the very definition of purity, is not found in blood alone. It lies in fear. The fear we inspire, the fear that keeps others in line, that ensures our power. It is the only true control." Draco's past self had absorbed these words, a chilling mantra that shaped his every interaction, his every belief. He had lived by them, believing them to be unshakable truths. But now, as he watched his father, truly listened to him without the veil of childhood obedience or adolescent rebellion, the words twisted in his stomach. Fear. Not respect, not loyalty, not even inherent superiority, but fear. This was the foundation upon which he had built his entire identity, a foundation built on brittle, shifting sand. The golden light began to fade, the air growing denser, pulling him back to the present. The walls of his West Wing room solidified around him, the familiar dust motes dancing in the cold lamp light. The strange candle, noticeably shorter again, now bore 2 distinct rings, marking the moments it had revealed. Draco slumped in his armchair, the weight of the memories crushing him. He had lived so much of his life ignoring, dismissing, misinterpreting. He had been so preoccupied with perceived slights, with upholding a decaying ideology, with his own internal turmoil, that he had failed to truly engage with the world around him. He had not only hurt others, but he had denied himself countless genuine moments, genuine connections. He began to understand, with a bitter clarity, how many lives he had simply failed to live. Not just Astoria's suffering he had ignored, or Blaise's outreach he had spurned, but his own life, shaped by a destructive, inherited philosophy. The candle was forcing him to see the vast, empty spaces within his own history. The candle's golden glow had become a nightly ritual, a painful pilgrimage into a past that offered no solace, yet held him captive. Each new memory revealed another facet of his failures, another moment of missed connection or self-imposed blindness. The rings on the candle grew steadily, each mark a testament to a truth he had previously evaded. The devastation deepened with every flicker of the flame, yet so did a morbid fascination, a desperate need to see what else he had overlooked. This night, as he lit the wick, the familiar softness enveloped the room. The air grew warm and sweet with the phantom scent of Astoria's favorite flowers, honeysuckle and jasmine. He felt the familiar backward pull, a gentle tug into the swirling depths of what had been. The scene solidified around him. He was in their bedroom, the one they had shared in the main part of the manor, bathed in the soft, intimate glow of the early morning light filtering through the lace curtains. Astoria was there, sitting up in bed, her hands resting gently on her swollen belly. She was perhaps 7 months pregnant with Scorpius, her face soft, radiant with a quiet anticipation that Draco had tried and failed to share. He saw himself in the memory, standing rigidly by the window, his back to her, clutching a half-empty glass of fire whiskey. He was pale, his jaw clenched, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. He remembered that time with acute, almost physical pain. The war was over, but its scars were fresh, and the future felt impossibly heavy. The idea of fatherhood, of bringing another Malfoy into a world that despised his name, had terrified him. He was supposed to be strong, infallible, just like his father had always demanded. But he wasn't. He was profoundly, utterly scared. He watched as Astoria's past self spoke, her voice gentle, unwavering. "Draco," she had murmured, her voice laced with an understanding he hadn't deserved. "Are you all right? You seem so distant." His past self had mumbled something about ministry affairs, about new regulations, about the weight of their family's legacy. Anything to avoid the truth. He wanted to tell her. He desperately wanted to confess his terror, to admit that he felt utterly unqualified to be a father, to protect this new life from the darkness that clung to their name. He wanted to tell her he was afraid of failing this child, just as he had failed himself and his family in the war. He wanted to tell her he was afraid of repeating his father's mistakes, of turning into the very man he now despised. He saw his past self's lips part, the words hovering on the tip of his tongue, a desperate plea for reassurance, for shared vulnerability. He saw the flicker of longing in his own eyes, a yearning to unburden himself, to reach for the solace of her understanding. But then the moment passed. The words remained unspoken. His past self had pressed his lips into a thin, unyielding line, turned back to the window, and simply said, "I'm fine, Astoria. Just tired." Watching this now as a silent, invisible witness, Draco felt a profound ache. He saw the raw vulnerability in his younger self's eyes, the desperate plea for understanding that he had swallowed whole. He saw the immense effort it took to keep that confession locked away, to maintain the facade of the unfeeling Malfoy heir. He saw the isolation he had chosen, not just for Astoria, but for himself, out of a misguided sense of pride and a crippling fear of weakness. For the first time, seeing himself from this detached, external perspective, Draco felt a startling wave of compassion for himself. Not for the arrogant boy, but for the terrified young man trapped by his own legacy, too afraid to admit his fear, too proud to ask for comfort. He saw the burden he had carried alone, a burden Astoria would have willingly shared, had he only let her. He had loved her fiercely in his own guarded way, but he had denied her the chance to truly see and comfort his deepest fears. And by doing so, he had denied himself true solace. The golden light flickered, the scent of honeysuckle faded. The room solidified around him, cold and quiet. The candle was shorter still, its dark rings now 3. Draco sat slumped, the raw emotion of the memory a burning ember in his chest. His gaze fell upon his desk, cluttered with ministry papers and forgotten quills. Tucked beneath a heavy legal tome was a small, creased piece of parchment. It was a note, written in a child's uncertain hand, left there perhaps earlier that day, or yesterday, he couldn't recall. It read in neat, careful script, "I miss you, Dad. Scorpius." His son, who also sought connection, who also left notes, who also waited for him to break through the impenetrable fog of his grief. Just as Astoria had waited. Just as Blaze had tried to reach out. The candle was showing him a pattern, a repeated failure to acknowledge those who loved him, those who sought him out, those who offered genuine connection. The realization was a sharp, painful jolt. He had been so lost in his own past that he was repeating its mistakes in the present. The "I miss you, Dad" note from Scorpius lay heavy on Draco's desk, a small, innocent indictment. It mirrored the unspoken fears of Astoria, the ignored camaraderie of Blaze, the twisted philosophy of his father. Each memory, courtesy of the strange candle, felt like another stone added to the crushing weight of his regrets. The candle itself, standing in its silver holder, was now noticeably smaller, its perfect white form diminishing with each nightly journey. For dark rings scored its side, mapping the painful terrain of his past. But with its diminishing size came an undeniable shift. Each time he lit it, the magical pull was stronger, the transition into memory more immediate, more vivid. The golden light flared brighter, the air softened with a deeper sigh, and the hum resonated with an almost unbearable clarity. He was no longer just an observer. He felt woven into the very fabric of the past, the emotions of his younger self amplified, almost overwhelming. It was as if the candle, in consuming itself, was offering a more potent, unvarnished truth. This night, as the flame blossomed, the scent of fresh snow and damp stone filled the air, tinged with the metallic tang of fear. The room dissolved, and he was no longer in the quiet solitude of the West Wing. He was in his bed at Hogwarts, in the Slytherin dormitories, cloaked in the oppressive darkness of the deepest night. The stone walls felt cold, damp, a tomb rather than a haven. He saw himself, a gaunt, terrified boy, barely 17, lying stiffly beneath the emerald-green hangings. His past self was wide awake, staring up at the ceiling, his eyes wide and hollow. It was the night before the Battle of Hogwarts. The silence in the dormitory was heavy, charged with unspoken dread, punctuated only by the distant, muffled sounds of the castle preparing for war. Hurried footsteps, hushed voices, the occasional clatter of magical preparations. Draco remembered that night with a sickening lurch in his gut. It was a crucible of his existence, a turning point where he had been utterly, profoundly useless. His mind in the memory was a tempest, chaos, shame, and fear. Fear for his own life, for his parents, for what Voldemort would do if he failed. Shame for the mark on his arm, for the choices he had made, for the monster he was forced to serve. And utter, debilitating chaos in his thoughts, a desperate scramble for an escape that never came. He saw himself in the memory, clenching his fists under the covers, tears silently tracking paths through the grime on his face. He wanted to scream, to run, to vanish. He remembered the desperate desire to do something, anything, to break free from the suffocating chains of his family's allegiance. He could have tried to warn someone. He could have fought back, however futilely. He could have refused to identify Harry, even under torture. He could have thrown his wand into the Great Lake and fled. But he didn't. He lay there, paralyzed. Paralyzed by fear, by conditioning, by a lifetime of being told he was meant for a single dark path. He remembered the moments, fleeting flashes, when a choice had presented itself. A look from Professor Snape, a silent plea from his mother, even a defiant glint in Harry Potter's eyes. Small chances easily dismissed. He saw them now vividly. He saw himself choosing inertia, choosing silence, choosing cowardice. The golden light pulsed with an almost unbearable intensity, reflecting the raw anguish of his younger self. He felt the cold sweat, the frantic beat of his heart, the shame that washed over him. He had been so close to choosing differently, to defying the narrative laid out for him. But he had not. He had simply existed, a prisoner of his own fear and the circumstances he felt powerless to escape. He saw himself lying there and understood the true depth of his inaction. He hadn't just stood by, he had actively chosen not to choose. He had let the war happen around him, let others fight and die, while he hid behind his name and his terror. The memory was a searing brand, showing him the moments he didn't do anything when he could have. The moment he could have been brave, even just for a flicker. The moment he could have truly stood for something other than himself. But he hadn't. The golden light flickered violently, then began its slow, inevitable retreat. The cold stone walls of his West Wing room solidified around him, the familiar scent of dust and neglect returning. The candle was even smaller, its flame a faint, exhausted flicker. A fifth dark ring, deeper and more pronounced than the others, marred its side. Draco lay back in his armchair, utterly spent, the weight of that night, of that inaction crushing him. The candle had shown him his deepest shame, the core of his paralysis, the moments where he had betrayed not others, but his own nascent desire for something more. The candle was a mere stub now, a tiny, defiant white sentinel in the silver holder. Its flame, though still golden, flickered erratically, as if struggling against its imminent demise. Each time Draco lit it, the magical pull was almost overwhelming, the return to the past instantaneous and profoundly real. He was no longer just an observer. He was almost there, breathing the air of the memory, feeling its texture, living its every nuance. The weight of his unlived moments, his missed chances, pressed down on him, but beneath it, a strange sense of clarity was beginning to emerge. This night, as the final sliver of wick caught fire, the golden light flared with an intensity that dwarfed the dying flame. The familiar hum swelled into a deep, resonant thrum that filled his entire being. He didn't feel a backward pull so much as a complete dissolution of the present. The West Wing room vanished, and he was immersed in a memory so profoundly intimate, so filled with a raw, overwhelming emotion that it stole his breath. He was in the hushed, sterile confines of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. The air hummed not with magic, but with the quiet, focused tension of creation. He heard the muffled sounds of nurses, the hurried whispers of healers, and then a tiny, fragile cry. It was the moment of Scorpius's birth. Draco saw himself in the memory, pale and trembling, standing awkwardly by Astoria's bedside. His younger self's hand was clutched tightly in Astoria's, his knuckles white. He remembered the blinding rush of emotions, fear, exhaustion, an alien tenderness, and a desperate, inarticulate hope. He had been terrified, convinced he would somehow taint this new life, drag it down with his own shadowed past. Astoria, radiant even in her exhaustion, looked up at him, her eyes shining with an immense, overflowing love. A healer, quiet and efficient, placed a small, bundled form into Draco's trembling arms. Scorpius. So tiny, so perfect, his miniature hand curling around Draco's finger with impossible strength. A raw, choked sound escaped Draco's past self, a sound he barely recognized as his own. He watched as Astoria's gaze, full of a fierce, protective love for their newborn son, shifted back to him. She squeezed his hand, her voice soft but clear, imbued with a wisdom that transcended the pain and exhaustion of childbirth. "Draco," she whispered, her eyes meeting his, holding him. "Look at him. Look at us. You will find a way to become who you have not yet been." The words, so gentle yet so powerful, resonated through him with an explosive force. He had always interpreted them through the lens of her declining health, as her quiet hope for his future with Scorpius after she was gone. He had thought she was reassuring him about raising their son alone, about learning to be a father. He had thought it was a message about her legacy, about her unwavering faith in him despite her illness. But now, witnessing the moment again, feeling the raw, unfiltered emotions, he understood. It wasn't about her illness, not primarily. It was about him. Her words weren't a passive wish for a future he might stumble into. They were an active charge, a quiet command. You will find a way to become who you have not yet been. She was telling him that he still had choices, that his story wasn't over, that his past didn't have to define his future. She saw the man he could be, the father he could become, not just after her death, but right then, in that very moment of new life. He saw the unwavering belief in her eyes, a belief he had consistently failed to live up to. She had known his fears, his self-doubt, his struggle with his family's shadow. And yet, she had believed in his capacity for change, for growth. The golden light flickered, drawing inwards, growing impossibly small. The air became thinner, colder. The hum faded, replaced by the profound, deafening silence of the West Wing. The scent of ozone and burning wax filled the air. Draco's eyes flew open. He was back in his armchair. The silver candlestick was before him, but the candle was gone, completely consumed. A tiny, faint wisp of smoke curled upwards from the empty holder, the final, invisible breath of the backward flame. He sat in the utter darkness, the memory of Astoria's words echoing in his mind, sharp and clear. You will find a way to become who you have not yet been. A powerful, undeniable realization slammed into him. His time wasn't over. His story wasn't finished. His time was still going forward. He hadn't been living in a static past. He had simply fallen behind. He had allowed grief and fear to anchor him to what was lost, while life and his son continued to move relentlessly forward. The candle had burned backward to show him he needed to start burning forward again. The choice always had been his. Draco awoke with a start, not to the customary chill of the West Wing, nor the crushing weight of grief, but to the blinding, unfamiliar brilliance of sunlight. It streamed through the narrow window, cutting through the dusty air, painting the room in hues of pale gold. For a moment, he simply lay there, disoriented, the memory of Astoria's words, "You will find a way to become who you have not yet been," echoing in the quiet of his mind. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his limbs, the lingering exhaustion from the emotional onslaught of the past nights. But it was different now. The fatigue wasn't a dull ache of despair. It was the honest tiredness that followed a profound journey. He glanced at the silver candlestick on his small table. It was empty. The candle was gone, completely consumed, leaving only a faint, lingering scent of beeswax and something else, something akin to clarity, like the fresh air after a storm. This was it. The first morning in months that he hadn't immediately thought of the candle, hadn't planned his evening around its ritual. The morbid curiosity, the desperate yearning to revisit the past, was gone. replaced by a strange, fragile sense of anticipation for something. He didn't know what, but it was forward-looking, not backward. He pushed himself out of the armchair, his movements stiff but purposeful. He didn't bother with his usual elaborate robes, simply donning a simple, unadorned shirt and trousers. There was no need for the carefully constructed facade today. The mirrors in the neglected room showed him a face that was gaunt, with shadows beneath his eyes, but in their depths, a faint flicker of something akin to resolve had replaced the habitual blankness. He walked out of the West Wing, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the once familiar silence. He bypassed the large, opulent drawing rooms, the formal dining hall where shadows of forgotten feasts seemed to linger. He moved through the main part of the manor, the air here feeling lighter, less oppressive, filled with the faint, comforting scent of breakfast being prepared by the house elves. He felt like a stranger in his own home, having been away for too long. He reached the heavy oak door leading to the gardens, a door he hadn't opened in what felt like an eternity. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The world outside burst upon him. Not the gray, muted landscape of his grief, but a vibrant, living canvas. The sky was an impossible blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. The ancient trees that bordered the grounds were swaying gently in a soft breeze, their leaves rustling with a cheerful whisper. The scent of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and blooming roses filled the air, sharp and invigorating. It was glorious. It was overwhelming. It was just light. His eyes scanned the sprawling lawns, the manicured hedges, the familiar old Quidditch pitch in the distance. And then he saw him. In the far corner of the garden, near the ancient oak where he himself had often spent idle afternoons as a child, Scorpius was playing. He was on the old wooden swing set, his small body arcing high into the air, his bright blonde hair catching the sunlight like a halo. He was laughing, a clear, pure sound that carried effortlessly across the expanse of grass, a sound Draco hadn't truly heard in months. Scorpius didn't see him. He was completely absorbed in his joyful ascent and descent, utterly present in the moment. For a long minute, Draco simply stood there watching. The urge to retreat, to vanish back into the comforting shadows of his solitude, flickered. But then, Astoria's words resonated again, clear as a bell. You will find a way to become who you have not yet been. This wasn't a memory, this was now. This was the present, stretching out before him, vibrant and demanding. His feet moved before his mind could fully register the decision. One step, then another. Slow at first, then gaining a steady rhythm. He walked across the sun-drenched lawn, directly towards the sound of his son's laughter. His destination wasn't a dusty book or a forgotten memory. For the first time in a very long time, Draco Malfoy was walking towards a future, towards a connection he had desperately needed, but had been too afraid to grasp. He was going to his son. The sunlight felt warm on Draco's face as he walked across the lawn. Each step was a quiet assertion, a breaking free from the suffocating enclosure of his grief. Scorpius was still laughing on the swing, completely unaware of the silent, monumental journey his father had just made. As Draco drew closer, the joyful sounds of his son's play began to fill the empty spaces within him, spaces that had echoed only with silence for months. He stopped a few paces from the swing set, watching Scorpius pump his legs, his small body soaring towards the clear blue sky. The boy's face was alight with pure, unadulterated happiness. Draco's own throat tightened with a sudden, unexpected emotion, a mixture of aching regret for the time he'd lost, and a fierce, protective love for this vibrant, living piece of Astoria. Scorpius, on his next downward arc, finally spotted him. His legs stopped pumping, and the swing gradually slowed to a gentle sway. His bright gray eyes, so like Draco's own but filled with an innocence Draco had long lost, widened in surprise. A flicker of hope, quickly followed by a familiar hesitancy, crossed his son's face. He knew his father's distant, haunted nature. Draco didn't say much. The words he'd rehearsed in his head, the explanations, the apologies, all felt inadequate, hollow. What could he say to explain months of self-imposed absence? Instead, he simply walked the last few steps, and with a soft sigh that seemed to release a lifetime of tension, he simply sat down beside Scorpius on the swing next to him. The old chains groaned softly under his weight. He didn't look at Scorpius directly, but gazed out at the distant trees, allowing the quiet space between them to fill with unspoken emotions. Scorpius remained silent for a long moment, the swing rocking gently under him. Then his small voice, surprisingly steady, broke the quiet. "The house elf said you weren't well, Dad." Draco swallowed, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. I wasn't, Scorpius. Another pause. The gentle breeze rustled through the leaves overhead. Mum would have wanted you to be happy again, Scorpius said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, but firm with conviction. It wasn't a question, but a statement of undeniable truth. Draco felt a sharp pang in his chest. Astoria's words from the final candle memory resonated powerfully. You will find a way to become who you have not yet been. His son, in his simple, profound way, was echoing that same hope, that same quiet challenge. He knew what Astoria would have wanted. He knew what Scorpius needed, and he knew what he himself needed, but had been too afraid to admit. He turned his head slowly, meeting Scorpius's earnest gaze. His son's eyes, so filled with innocent longing, pierced through his remaining layers of grief and self-pity. I don't know if I can, Scorpius, Draco admitted, his voice rough, and used to expressing such raw vulnerability. It was the most honest thing he had said in months. He didn't promise what he couldn't deliver, but he offered something far more meaningful. But I can try. The words hung in the air between them, small but heavy with unspoken meaning. They weren't a grand declaration, but a quiet commitment. A promise to himself, to Astoria, and most importantly to the small, hopeful boy sitting beside him. Silence settled between them again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of grief, nor the uncomfortable silence of avoidance. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the gentle creak of the swings, the distant chirping of birds, and the soft rustle of leaves in the light wind. It was the sound of two people, father and son, finally breathing the same air, sharing the same moment and tentatively, bravely, stepping towards a shared future. Draco felt the sun on his skin, the gentle sway of the swing, the warmth of his son's presence beside him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the simple sensory details wash over him. The candle had shown him his past. Now his son was showing him his future. The day had unfolded with a quiet grace Draco hadn't known in years. He'd stayed with Scorpius in the garden, watching him play, listening to his chatter about imaginary creatures and Quidditch. They hadn't talked much, but simply being there, present and attentive, felt like a monumental act. The lightness he'd felt that morning lingered, a fragile but persistent hope. As evening drew in, painting the sky with the gentle hues of sunset, Draco returned to the west wing. The room, usually a haven of isolated gloom, felt different now. The dust motes still danced in the dying light, but they no longer seemed to carry the weight of forgotten despair. He walked over to the small table where the silver candlestick had sat for so many nights. It was still there, elegant and empty. He picked up the candlestick. The inscription, Quid alita vidir vols retrorsum specta, that which he wished to see differently, look backward, seemed to shimmer faintly under his touch. The candle had done its work. It had forced him to look backward, to confront the unlived moments, the unspoken words, the choices he had evaded. And in doing so, it had shown him the path forward. He didn't need its golden, distorting light anymore. The lessons were etched into his soul, not just its wax. With a deep, cleansing breath, Draco walked to the old, battered chest of drawers where he'd found the candlestick. He opened the top drawer, a silent click in the quiet room, and carefully placed the silver candlestick back inside. It was a deliberate act of closure, a respectful farewell to the powerful, painful magic that had guided him. There was no candle to light, no past to revisit, just the future waiting. He moved to his desk, picking up a fresh piece of parchment and a quill. For a long moment, he hesitated. The thought of reaching out, of exposing his newfound vulnerability, was daunting. His interactions with the outside world, particularly with those from his Hogwarts past, had been fraught with tension, suspicion, and his own ingrained pride. Yet, the memories of Astoria's unwavering belief, of Scorpius's quiet plea, urged him on. The old ways, the old masks, no longer served him. He dipped the quill in ink, the scratching sound loud in the stillness, and began to write. He didn't write an elaborate apology, nor a lengthy explanation. Just a few simple, honest words, words that marked a profound shift, a tentative bridge reaching across years of animosity and misunderstanding. He addressed it to Harry Potter. The message was brief, shorn of any formality or pretense. Just 2 lines, direct and unadorned. If you have time, I would like to talk. He folded the parchment, sealed it with a simple, unmarked wax seal, and placed it on the desk, ready for an owl in the morning. It was a terrifying act of surrender, an admission that he needed more than his self-imposed solitude. He didn't expect an answer, not really. But the act of sending it, the very intention of reaching out, felt like a physical weight lifting from his shoulders. The room was growing dim as the last vestiges of twilight faded. Draco looked around, no longer seeing a prison of grief, but simply a room. His room. He reached out and, with a silent lumos, lit the non-magical lamp on his table. Its familiar, steady yellow light filled the space, warm and unwavering. It was an ordinary light, but it felt profoundly comforting. It was the light of the present, the light of reality. He didn't move. He stayed in the room, not fleeing from the silence, not seeking solace in the ghosts of the past. He simply sat in his armchair, the warmth of the lamp on his face, the cool weight of the silver candlestick gone from his hand. The journey backward was complete. His time, at last, was truly burning forward. There was work to be done, difficult conversations to be had, and a son to raise. And for the first time in a very long time, Draco Malfoy felt ready to begin.